2 hours before showtime, a Soviet official steps into the concrete corridor beneath the arena and tells Klaus Meine, in careful, broken English, that tonight's concert may not happen at all. Rudolf Schenker freezes, with his guitar half out of its case. Outside, thousands of Leningrad kids are already lining up in the April cold, some of them clutching bootleg cassettes worn thin from years of replaying. Inside, a folder full of stamps and signatures is suddenly not enough. Somewhere between the loading dock and the mixing desk, the most important show of the Scorpions' career is hanging by a thread, and nobody in that hallway yet knows how it ends. What happened in the next 90 minutes would never make a single headline, but it would quietly plant the seed for one of the most famous songs of the century. To understand why this single night mattered so much, you have to understand what it took just to get a hard rock band from West Germany onto Soviet soil in the first place. Scorpions had spent the better part of a decade becoming one of the biggest rock exports in the world, filling arenas from Tokyo to Los Angeles, riding the global success of songs like Rock You Like a Hurricane and No One Like You. But behind the Iron Curtain, their records existed mostly as smuggled copies, traded hand to hand, dubbed onto cheap cassette tape by teenagers who risked real trouble just for owning one. The Soviet Union had only recently begun cracking its cultural door open. Mikhail Gorbachev's twin policies of glasnost and perestroika were loosening decades of suspicion toward the West, and a handful of foreign acts had slipped through that narrow gap. Elton John had performed in the USSR back in 1979. Billy Joel had toured Soviet cities the previous summer in 1987, playing to crowds hungry for anything Western. But those were piano ballads and polished pop, considered relatively tame by the men who approved such things. A leather-clad hard rock band, known for wailing guitar solos and crowds that screamed themselves hoarse, was an entirely different proposition. Every official who had to put his signature on this tour knew exactly what he was risking. Getting to that hallway in Leningrad had taken close to 2 years of quiet, grinding negotiation. Scorpions' management worked through Soviet state promoters and the cultural bureaucracy known as Goskoncert, the agency that decided which foreign artists were permitted to perform and under exactly what restrictions. Every amplifier, every lighting rig, every mile of cable had to be itemized, inspected, and cleared through customs officers who treated a rock band's equipment convoy with the same wariness as a foreign military shipment. Visas were delayed, then reissued. Contracts were redrafted in 2 languages, then argued over clause by clause, sentence by sentence, sometimes over a single disputed word. Klaus Meine has since described the sense that the entire arrangement could collapse at any stage, right up until the band's plane actually touched Soviet tarmac. And even then, nothing felt guaranteed. This was not simply a concert tour. It was a small diplomatic mission, dressed head to toe in leather and denim, walking straight into the heart of a system built on control. Landing in Leningrad felt like stepping into another century entirely. The band looked out through rain-streaked windows at gray apartment blocks stretching toward a flat horizon, canals still crusted with the last of the winter ice, streets almost empty of the neon and advertising they took completely for granted back home. At the hotel, quiet men in plain, unremarkable suits lingered near the elevators and the restaurant entrance, polite but unmistakably watchful, assigned to track the band's every public movement. Interpreters smiled warmly and translated everything precisely, But everyone in the room understood that certain words were being carefully weighed before they ever left anyone's mouth. And yet beneath that constant watchfulness, something else was already stirring. Hotel staff, who were supposed to remain coolly professional, began asking shy, eager questions about the band's albums. A young porter admitted, almost in a whisper, that he owned a battered, much-played cassette of Blackout, and that he had learned the guitar solos by ear from a recording so worn it barely played anymore. The Cold War was still very much alive in the official channels, in the stamped documents and the assigned minders. But in the stairwells and back corridors, something warmer had already begun leaking through the cracks in the system. The days before the show only tightened the tension. A crate of stage lighting was mysteriously held at customs for nearly 48 hours, with no clear explanation offered beyond vague references to inspection procedures. Crew members paced hotel lobbies, unable to reach anyone with real authority, watching the clock and wondering whether the equipment would ever be released in time for a proper sound check. When the crate finally arrived, half a day before doors were due to open, the crew worked through the night rigging a stage built for gymnastics floor routines and Communist Party congresses, never designed with a wailing rock and roll show in mind. Soldiers in dress uniform were posted at regular intervals along the arena walls, watching the unfamiliar spectacle of roadies taping down cables with an expression somewhere between suspicion and fascination. Every element of the production had supposedly already been negotiated on paper. No pyrotechnics, capped decibel levels, a rigid seating plan meant to keep thousands of fans in their assigned rows instead of surging toward the stage the way crowds did in the West. On paper, it all sounded perfectly manageable. Standing in that echoing hall with armed soldiers watching every soundcheck note, the fragility of the entire arrangement was impossible to ignore. That fragility snapped fully into view the afternoon before the show. A senior officer, flanked by two cultural ministry representatives clutching identical clipboards, arrived backstage with a fresh set of objections. Reports had reached him, he said, of a Western rock crowd turning violent at another concert elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc only months earlier. Chairs thrown, barricades breached, ambulances called. He was not willing to attach his name, his city, and his career to a repeat performance on his own watch. He raised, quite bluntly, the possibility of shutting the concert down entirely, or else gutting it into something closer to a subdued theater recital, stripped of anything that might excite a crowd already primed to explode after years of pent-up longing. Crew members froze mid-task, cables still in hand. A young translator's voice cracked slightly as she relayed his words to the band. For a group that had crossed a continent of red tape, delayed visas, and impounded equipment to reach this exact stage, the possibility that it could all end here, in a gray hallway, over a clipboard of unmet demands, felt almost too bitter to accept. For a few unbearable minutes, nobody moved. The band's tour manager tried reasoning in rapid, pleading English, and the interpreter struggled to keep pace, her translations arriving half a beat behind the rising tension in the room. A lighting technician quietly began coiling cable, assuming the worst. Someone floated the idea of simply performing an acoustic set instead, stripped down and harmless, anything to salvage the night. But the suggestion died the moment it was spoken, because everyone in that corridor understood it would betray exactly what these fans had been waiting years to hear. Rudolf Schenker, normally the calm, businesslike one, felt his jaw tighten. He had negotiated record contracts and world tours across a dozen countries, but never anything quite like this. A negotiation where the other side held soldiers, not lawyers. It was in that charged silence, with the officer's clipboard still raised and the translator waiting for someone to say something worth translating, that Klaus quietly stepped forward and asked for the room. It was Klaus Meine, soft-spoken but quietly unshakable, who asked for a few minutes alone with the officer, Rudolf Schenker standing steady at his side. What followed was not a shouting match, but something closer to a careful negotiation between two men trying to understand each other across a language, a history, and an ideology that neither of them fully controlled. Through the interpreter, Klaus explained that the band had no interest whatsoever in chaos, that they had traveled all this way because they genuinely respected the Soviet audience enough to want a real connection with them, not a riot and not a headline. Rudolf, ever the pragmatic architect behind the band's business decisions, offered concrete concessions on the spot. A scaled-back light show, security stationed exactly where the officer wanted his men, a personal assurance that the band would slow the pacing themselves if the crowd ever grew unruly. But it was a smaller, quieter moment that seemed to genuinely shift the room. Klaus spoke, almost offhandedly, about growing up in a divided Germany, about walls and checkpoints that had shaped his own childhood long before he ever picked up a microphone, and about how music had always felt like the one thing capable of traveling where politics simply could not follow. The officer said nothing for a long moment, studying Klaus's face. Then, slowly, he closed his folder. The concession that followed was narrow, but it was real. The show would go on, largely as originally planned, with security stationed visibly around the hall, but instructed to hold back unless something genuinely dangerous occurred. Word passed backstage in relieved, half-whispered bursts. Crew members who had already begun quietly disconnecting cables in anticipation of a shutdown reversed course and scrambled to finish the rig. Klaus and Rudolf exchanged a look that carried more than either of them could have put into words in that moment, equal parts exhaustion and disbelief. There was no time left to celebrate. The doors were already scheduled to open, and beyond them a crowd that had waited years for exactly this night was pressing hard toward the entrances, utterly unaware of how close the whole evening had just come to vanishing. When the lights finally dropped and the band walked out onto that stage, the roar that met them seemed to physically shake the hall's concrete walls. Row after row of young Soviet fans, dressed in whatever homemade approximation of Western rock style they could piece together, screamed lyrics back in accented but note-perfect English. Songs learned entirely from cassette tapes copied so many times the vocals had blurred almost into static. Soldiers stationed along the aisles, under strict orders to keep order, visibly struggled to hold composed faces as the music swept over them, too. Here and there, fans broke from their assigned seats and surged toward the front, and for one tense moment, security began to move in response. But the flashpoint the officer had feared all week never actually arrived. Instead, there was singing, arms raised in the half-dark, strangers embracing between songs, an entire arena full of people who had grown up being told the West was the enemy, now finding themselves undeniably, joyfully at home inside a Scorpions song. Klaus Meine would later describe standing on that stage and feeling, for the very first time in his life, that the wall separating two worlds had a crack running clean through the middle of it, and that he was watching it happen in real time. Backstage after the final encore, soaked in sweat and still catching their breath, the band found the same senior officer waiting near the dressing room door, his clipboard nowhere in sight. He said little, but he extended his hand to Klaus, a formal, almost stiff gesture that carried more weight than any speech could have. Through the interpreter, he admitted, quietly enough that only the people closest could hear, that he had never seen a Soviet crowd behave with such open, unguarded joy, and that he had feared exactly the wrong thing all along. Rudolf Schenker would later call it one of the strangest handshakes of his career, exchanged with a man who had nearly shut the whole night down hours earlier. Crew members allowed themselves a real celebration for the first time since landing, passing around whatever drinks they could find, replaying the loudest sing-along moments from memory. Klaus stayed quiet for a while, still absorbing what he had just watched happen in front of him, a wall of skepticism cracking open in real time, powered by nothing more than 3 chords and a chorus everyone somehow already knew by heart. The tour that followed carried Scorpions through several more Soviet cities, but nothing quite matched the knife's-edge tension of that Leningrad negotiation, the sense that history itself was being quietly renegotiated in a backstage hallway between a rock singer and one anxious, skeptical Soviet officer. Within a year, the band returned to the Soviet Union for the Moscow Music Peace Festival of 1989, standing shoulder to shoulder with Western and Soviet musicians on a stage that nobody could have imagined possible a decade earlier, in front of a crowd of young people who had grown up on smuggled tapes, just like the ones passed hand to hand back in Leningrad. And within 2 more years, watching the astonishing, rapid collapse of the very barriers that had once nearly ended their Leningrad show altogether, Klaus Meine sat down with a simple acoustic melody and began writing about change carried on the wind, a song that would go on to become the defining anthem of an era ending, sung in languages he had never even studied. But its real origin, the true seed of it, was planted earlier than most fans have ever realized. In a gray concrete corridor beneath a Leningrad sports arena, in the quiet, tense minutes when 2 German rock musicians convinced one wary Soviet officer that music was not a threat to be contained behind checkpoints and clipboards, but a bridge that was already being built whether anyone approved it or not. That corridor conversation never made a single headline. It barely earned a line in the tour diary. Most of the fans singing along that night never knew how close the whole evening had come to being canceled just hours earlier. But without those 90 tense minutes, without Klaus Meine's quiet words about walls and childhood and a divided Germany, there may have been no concert in Leningrad that spring, no crowd breaking into song against every rule they had been taught, and perhaps, years later, no anthem carried on the wind at all.